Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, which is a historically humanist congregation, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. For the past couple of weeks now, we've been talking about the social gospel, a very particular kind of movement, mostly within Protestant denominations, and now a movement towards social witness in a very kind of different flavor, but also a continuity to it. And today I want to do a quick summary just so we can watch that continuity a little bit more. So after the Civil War, and we're talking about the 1870s when the social gospel becomes a thing, after the Civil War, choice became a reality for many and now most American adults. Indeed, U.S. religion has operated on a consumer model over time. That is, we are going to cater to people, and our product religion is going to be where you want in the niche. So for many, and now most American adults, congregations are voluntary associations. People choose to align with particular religions, particular denominations, and particular congregations. Now, obviously, this was not always the truth. For Roman Catholics, it continued not to be that way for some time with the parish model. But for the Protestant denominations in the U.S., people were able to switch around, except in very rural areas where things were still locked down. But choice becomes very much what religion is about, and religion becomes a voluntary association. You want to be there. You don't have to be there. Now, the post-Civil War social gospel movement brought politics overtly into religious discussion. I talked about that several days last week, how the social gospel people started talking about politics, saying Jesus would say this about this political or social situation. All right, and that was the way they did the equation. And they were overtly talking about the life of Jesus, not necessarily what had developed over time as Christianity. Now, some people, of course, rejected this trend outright. The spiritual realm and the political realm must remain separate. And so for those people who thought that, guess what? They're going to not voluntarily go to those denominations anymore. They're going to exit the building and go to spiritual places that don't talk about politics. So that's the first big exodus based on the social gospel. Now, some objected to political leanings of the denominations. The denominations were just too identified with particular political sides. And they said, you know, I'm not that, and I'm so out of here. And so they go and find a denomination or a congregation that is closer to what they see as their political beliefs. In addition, of course, race and social class have always been major factors in denominational choice in the United States. So let's take a very simplified example. This is leaving off a lot of high spots, but we'll when we get to the end, see if you think of this. I've described this kind of maybe the way it is. So let's take a typical Unitarian in 1875. Here's a dapper Unitarian gentleman over here. He is probably a professional. He's a doctor or a lawyer or some kind of trained professional. He's not going to be a cowboy, as Waylon Jennings would say his mama shouldn't raise him as. Very unlikely to be a cowboy. He's going to be some kind of urban professional of some sort. Probably he's a Republican at this time period because of the way the Republican Party had been identified with abolition and then the support of African Americans. And he was probably center-right in his politics. He's interested in social issues. He knows that poverty is an issue. He knows that industrialization is an issue, et cetera. And certainly he identifies as a Christian during this time period with the belief that Jesus was the most perfect person ever who ever lived and was very worthy of emulation. This is the idea of the Unitarians in the late 19th century. They also thought that most of them thought that Christianity would very soon be a world religion a complete world religion due to its clear superiority to other religions. They weren't thinking that was because Europeans were taking over a lot of people's property and were colonialists. No, they thought that Christianity was superior in some way. And here's a very dapper late Victorian Unitarian woman who was also a minister. And another thing is they believed in science. By 1900, this person believed that women should have equal rights and responsibilities as citizens. Those who did not believe this left the church. And it may seem obvious to left-leaning people that obviously women should have rights, but guess what? Many denominations today don't think that. So that is still a political and religious choice today. By 1917, war hysteria had split the nation. Some Unitarian ministers were overtly pacifist. I discussed this last week. Many patriots, therefore, left the Unitarian Church. You guys are too liberal. This is a war that needs winning. It's a fight for civilization and Christianity. We must do it. You guys are Looney Tunes, right? So by 1930, many Unitarian ministers believed the social conditions created poverty, crime, and disease. These must be eradicated, and those who did not believe this left the church. Especially during the 1930s, with social conditions so bad, many Unitarians began to believe that the only way out was government intervention. Again, if you didn't think that, you were going to start thinking about leaving the Unitarian Church of the day. By 1950, many Unitarian ministers believed that God was a metaphor or even non-existent. This, of course, was because of the humanist movement that First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis spearheaded in the day, and it spreads out across the U.S. Fairly quickly for about 20 years. Also, they thought science was the arbiter of truth and the answer to human problems. Those who did not agree, they could leave the church. Then there was the 1960s, which is the absolute watershed in terms of Unitarian and then Unitarian Universalism. The typical Unitarian minister came to believe in abortion rights and birth control, full civil rights for African Americans, and federal government intervention in poverty and social issues. Famous photo that was on the cover of the UU World back in the day. This is a Unitarian minister who's just spent the night in jail with Martin Luther King. So the Unitarians very much get involved in the civil rights movement, and it still remains a kind of watershed moment among sort of the story, the narrative, or even the mythology of Unitarian Universalism. Then the greatest watershed moment was Vietnam. The typical Unitarian minister was concerned in 1965, but probably still following a more or less party line on this, but they were overtly against the war, most of them by 1968. If you did not agree, you left the church. And this was a mass exodus of people. And the greatest shift in who were Unitarian Universalists occurred during the Vietnam War period, because the Unitarian ministers tended to think that they were speaking out in a moral way against an immoral war. So a lot of people left. Thus, in a century, 1875, 1975, the average Unitarian became a Unitarian Universalist, still most likely an educated professional. UUs are always up there in terms of the number of people who have advanced degrees. Jewish folk tend to be the top, Hindus usually about the second, but very educated people. And most likely, most UUs found Christianity a bit long in the tooth. It was no longer the Christianity that was going to sweep the world, and it was no longer the leading edge of human thought. It probably was a little bit dated, actually. And so this person became interested in world religions and probably believed human religion had many common threads. I've talked about this quite a bit several weeks ago in that movement in the mid to late 19th century, when all these other religions were being discovered due to colonialism that began to come in and give new ideas to people. And this person believed in science, but also considered some things beyond the scope of science. The real belief in science begins to get a little bit shaky in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Now, note that Unitarian Universalism was still predominantly Euro-American and middle class. This is still the case in the U.S. In the U.S., still today, not true in all countries, but still today in the U.S., education tends to lead to higher income and therefore higher social status. That is changing, and that will be a demographic to watch as Unitarian Universalism goes toward 2050. Okay, so let's look quickly at the political leanings of U.S. religious groups. This is from 2014, but I chose a little graph because it's easier to see than some of them. So the red is Republican, the blue Democrat, and gray is for no interest or I go back and forth. So 70% of Mormons are Republican, identify as Republican. The Southern Baptist Convention, the biggest convention in the U.S., 64% are Republican, 26% Democratic, and 10% are those swing voters out there probably. The United Methodist Church, which in this graph is going to stand in for Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, Congregationalists, etc., ELC, Lutherans, etc., the main line that we've been talking about, 54% are Republican and 35% are Democrat, with 11% being somewhere in between. All right, so there's your 50-50 split beginning to show up in the mainline churches, which is important. Catholics, 37% are Republican. Orthodox Christian, by which they mean Greek Orthodox Christian, 34% are Republican. And you see how this graph is going to drop off very, very quickly. Among Jewish population, 26% are Republican, 64% are Democratic. Agnostics tend to be 21% Republican and 64% along in there Democratic. They are equating liberal and Democrat here, so we have to give them that. Muslims, 17% are Republican, Buddhists, 16%, atheists at 15% of them are Republican identified, 69% are Democrat. And notice that this number is also growing over here. 17% will be deciding according to not necessarily party affiliation. Hindus, 13%. And the lowest, because they're not supposed to have a political, but sometimes they do, is a Jehovah's Witness, which 75% lean no way, which of course is what they're supposed to be doing if you're a Jehovah's Witness. Now, let's look, and again, I said, yeah, I'm going to be very paint with a very broad brush about how Unitarianism just changes over that century and more. But today, the Pew research folks don't seem to know that Unitarians are no longer Unitarians. We're Unitarian Universalists. But look at the party affiliation among Unitarians. 14% are Republican, 2% say they don't have any particular leaning, and 84% say that they are Democrat or Democrat leaning. Now, this is absolutely huge. Remember, that United Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, they've got a 50-50 split that ministers have to deal with, congregations have to wrestle with. But guess what? In Unitarian Universalist congregations, you can count on a huge percentage of people being liberal, Democrat, etc. So what's that going to do for the ministers who are interested in social concerns? Well, they're going to talk more about it because they have the confidence that people in the pews do agree with them. And so what's that going to do to the next time a moderate Republican walks through the doors of Unitarian Church? Well, they're going to hear about what all those liberal Democrats think are the moral thing to do, and they're not going to come back. Again, we can discuss whether that's right or not, or ethical or not, whatever, but that's just the facts as demographics do show them, that 84% of Unitarians now lean toward the Democratic Party. That's a vast shift. As I mentioned, center-right was probably where those Unitarians were back in 1875, slowly moving with a grand acceleration during the 1960s with all the social things that developed during that time period. Now let's look at the negative perceptions of political parties by party affiliation. Percent who say. So 81% of Republicans, and this is a recent poll, 2020, says the Democratic Party has been taken over by socialists. That's a relatively large percentage of Republicans think about that of Democrats. Notice the other side of this graph. The Republican Party has been taken over by racists. 78% of Democrats agree with that statement. So it's 80, almost 80, right there. And you notice that then we have an extreme disagreement between the parties as how they see each other. Republicans predominantly think that the Democratic Party is headed for socialism, and the Democrats overwhelmingly think that the Republican Party is headed for white supremacy and racism. So there is your split, and I was trying to trace it a little bit so that you can see kind of how that happened. What's going to happen in the future? Well, that's what I want to talk about next week. Churches finding the next big cause. We do have several things going on in the social fabric of the United States these days that will determine how churches go and how the social witness of churches go in the future. Several things are actually happening. We can take a look at those on Monday. We'll be meeting Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of next week if you want to join in. Also on Sunday at 10:30 a.m., one of our assistant ministers, Jim Fody, will be talking about the noise and haste, stillness reconsidered. So let's think about taking a little bit of stillness during this sometimes too bustly holiday season, and a season that may be a little bit depressing or disturbing for some people this year because of COVID, etc. So join in 10:30 a.m. on Sunday morning Central Time, and I'll be back next week with more Coffee and Wisdom. Thanks a lot.